The military dog had already taken down two security guards when the doctors finally admitted they had no idea what to do. The wounded Navy SEAL on the gurney was bleeding out. His vitals were crashing, and the 100-pound Belgian Malinois standing over him had locked onto every person in that trauma bay like they were the enemy. Nobody could get close enough to save him. Nobody except the quiet blonde nurse in the corner, the one the trauma chief had spent 6 months calling a waste of a scrub slot. She hadn't said a word yet. She didn't need to. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because stories like this one don't end where you think they will. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next in that trauma bay is going to change everything you thought you knew about who belongs in that room. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Maplewood General Hospital in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was already running on fumes. 3 nurses had called out sick. The waiting room had backed up past the double doors into the parking structure. A 6-year-old with a broken arm had been waiting 2 hours because the pediatric attending kept getting pulled into adult trauma. And the charge nurse, a heavy-set woman named Deborah Fisk, who had been doing this job for 22 years, had the look of someone who had stopped believing in shift changes. Nurse Lena Marsh was at the supply station on the East Corridor, restocking IV bags, when the radio cracked down the hall crackled loud enough to cut through the ambient noise of the ER. Incoming trauma. Military. Single male. Gunshot wound to the left shoulder. Secondary laceration to the femoral. GSW entry appears close range. Patient is a Navy. A burst of static. Dog handler. Animal is on scene. Repeat. Animal is on scene and has been assessed as hostile. Security has been notified. Lena set down the IV bag. Around her, the corridor came to life in the controlled, frantic way that trauma teams do when they've heard the word gunshot. Feet moving, voices clipped, the squeak of wheels on linoleum. She stepped aside to let a crash cart pass. Nobody looked at her. That was normal. She had been at Maplewood General for 7 months, and in those 7 months, she had learned that being invisible in this building was not an accident. It was policy. Unofficial, unspoken, and enforced by one man, Dr. Marcus Holt. He was the head of trauma surgery, 44 years old, tall, with the kind of jawline and CV that made hospital administrators give him whatever he wanted. He had trained at Johns Hopkins, published in 3 major journals, and walked the halls of Maplewood General like the building had been constructed around him personally. Nurses spoke about him in 2 registers, the formal one used when he was in earshot, and the real one used in the break room at 2 in the morning when the coffee had gone stale and everyone was too tired to pretend. The real register was not kind. Lena had made the mistake, in her 2nd week, of flagging a medication dosage discrepancy during a post-op review. She had been quiet about it, brought it to the attending directly, kept her voice neutral, just noted that the chart read 40 milligrams where protocol indicated 20. The attending had thanked her. The correction was made. The patient was fine. Dr. Holt had pulled her aside the next morning. "You're a floor nurse," he said. "Not aggressive, just flat. The kind of flat that was worse than aggression. You stock supplies. You monitor vitals. You do not second-guess surgical dosing. Are we clear?" The patient, "Are we clear, Ms. Marsh?" She had said yes, because she needed the job, because she had bills and a lease and a reason for being in Harrisburg that had nothing to do with winning arguments with men like Marcus Holt. That had been the beginning. Over the following months, Holt had quietly, methodically made sure she stayed small. She wasn't assigned to critical cases. She wasn't included in trauma briefings unless there was no one else available to take notes. When she offered observations in team meetings, rare because she'd learned quickly, he would redirect the conversation without acknowledging she'd spoken, like she'd produced a sound without content. The other nurses noticed. A few of them, Deborah, a 2nd-year nurse named Priya, who had a sharp sense of humor and an even sharper memory, had tried to push back in small ways. Bringing Lena into conversations, crediting her observations. It didn't change much. In a hierarchy built around one man's opinion, the people below him could only do so much. Lena had stopped expecting it to change. She had not, however, stopped paying attention. The ambulance bay doors slammed open at 11:54 p.m. The gurney came in fast, 2 paramedics working both sides, one holding manual pressure on the shoulder wound, the other calling out vitals in the flat professional tone of someone who has done this too many times to inflect. Male, approximately 35, GSW, left shoulder, through and through, significant blood loss. BP is 88/60 and dropping, heart rate 112. The dog came through the door a step behind the gurney. Not restrained, not leashed. Moving with the controlled intensity of an animal that knew exactly where it was going and had decided that nothing in the building was going to get in its way. It was a Belgian Malinois, compact, dense with muscle, the kind of dog that looked like someone had taken a German shepherd and refined it down to pure function. Its coat was sand and black. Its eyes were a dark amber that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back wrong, too alert, too focused. It moved to the left side of the gurney and stayed there, shoulder height to the patient's arm. The first security officer reached for it at the trauma bay doors. The dog moved so fast that the room seemed to skip a frame. One moment the officer's hand was extended, the next he was stumbling backward into the wall with a 4-inch gash on his forearm, and the dog had not broken stride. The second officer drew a canister. "Do not," one of the paramedics said sharply. "Do not spray that animal in an enclosed space with a trauma patient. I am serious." The second officer stopped. The dog took up a position at the head of the gurney between the patient and the room and stood there. The trauma bay went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when the people in them don't know what the next move is. Dr. Marcus Holt walked in from the east corridor at a pace that communicated authority even when he wasn't saying anything. He took one look at the patient, one look at the dog, and turned to the security team. "Control that animal." "Sir," took down Officer Reeves when "I don't care how it happened. I have a trauma patient who needs surgery preparation and I cannot work around a hostile animal. Get it out." "Dr. Holt," the senior paramedic said, pulling off a glove and reaching for the patient's chart. "That's Commander Declan Rourke, active duty Navy SEAL. The dog is a certified military working dog. His name is registered as Unit K7 Brace, deployed asset. His handler," she paused. "Commander Rourke is his handler. That dog is not going to leave that man's side without either a direct military command or then call whoever gives the command. We've been trying. It's a classified unit. The duty officer is then sedate the dog." The room shifted, not physically, but something moved in the air of the trauma bay. The kind of shift that happens when someone says something that multiple people know is wrong, but only some of them have the standing to say so. Dr. Lena Marsh, who was not technically supposed to be in the trauma bay for this case, was standing near the east wall with a hemostatic dressing kit she'd pulled from supply before she'd understood what the call was. She had come in because the supply tech was 3 halls away and someone needed to bring the kit, and she had been the one holding it. She stayed. She watched the dog. It wasn't attacking, it was assessing. There was a difference, a real, observable difference, in the way an animal behaved when it was defending versus when it was waiting for something it recognized. This dog was waiting. Its ears were up, rotating slightly. Its eyes moved around the room in a pattern that was almost methodical. It wasn't looking for a threat to engage. It was looking for someone specific. "Sedate it," Holt said again. "We don't have time for—" "You can't sedate a military working dog without a handler authorization or a veterinary assessment," Lena said. The room went very still. Holt turned slowly. In 7 months, she had learned exactly what his face looked like when she said something in a register he didn't think she had access to. It was the expression of a man recalibrating in real time, deciding which kind of dismissal to deploy. "Ms. Marsh," he said. His voice was measured, almost patient. The tone adults use with children who have wandered into conversations they don't understand. "This is a trauma stabilization. Unless you're here to deliver that kit—" "I am," she said. "And that dog is not hostile, it's in protection mode. If you sedate it without authorization, you're looking at a federal violation of the Military Working Dog Act. That's a minimum 30-day suspension of institutional federal contracts." She kept her voice flat. She did not look away from him. "Maplewood General holds 3 of those contracts. I looked it up. The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. It felt longer. "Get me someone from Federal Liaison," Holt said, turning back to the patient and making the decision with the efficiency of a man who had already stopped thinking about the thing that had just surprised him. "And somebody pull that dog back from the gurney so we can work." 3 nurses moved toward the dog. The Malinois lowered its head. The sound it produced was not quite a growl. It was something under a growl, more like a vibration that started in its chest and expanded outward, and every person in the room felt it in their back teeth. The nurses stopped. "It's not going to respond to you," Lena said. She was already moving toward the gurney set, not rushing, not hesitating, moving the way she'd learned to move in the specific circumstances where moving fast made things worse. "Give me the space." "Miss Marsh, I'm not going to approach it yet." She stopped 6 feet from the dog and crouched down to its eye level. Below it, actually, which was not instinct, it was training, and she knew it was training, and she filed that thought away for later. "I'm just going to stay here for a minute." Holt's jaw tightened. She could see it from the corner of her eye. "We don't have a minute. That patient is—" "I know what the patient is," she said quietly. "Give me 60 seconds." She didn't look at the dog directly. She looked at a point on the floor about 2 feet to its left, and she breathed, in through the nose, count of 4, out through the mouth, count of 6. And she waited. The dog's ears rotated toward her. She let 15 seconds pass. Then she raised her left hand, palm out, fingers together, a specific positioning that was not a gesture anyone in that room would recognize as meaningful unless they'd spent time in a specific context with a specific kind of unit. The dog's posture changed, not dramatically, not in the way that would read as significant to someone who didn't know what they were looking at. The tension in its hindquarters eased by perhaps 10%. Its head came up slightly, its eyes fixed on her with a different quality. Not threat assessment anymore. Something else. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of it. "What is she doing?" someone said behind her. "I don't know," Priya's voice. "But it's working." Lena held the position. She kept breathing. She did not move closer. She was aware of the patient's monitors behind her. The alarm hadn't tripped yet, but the rate was accelerating toward a threshold. And she was aware of Holt standing somewhere to her right, making the calculation every trauma surgeon makes when the clock is running and the room isn't cooperating. She was also aware that her left sleeve had ridden up. She pulled it down with her right hand, a reflex she'd developed over the years without deciding to develop it. The motion was small. Nobody in the room would have clocked it. The dog did. Its eyes dropped to her forearm, came back up to her face, and then it sat. Just sat. Folded its hindquarters down in a clean, controlled movement and positioned itself at the patient's left shoulder instead of blocking the gurney. Not retreating, not submitting. Moving into a posture that said, in the language it had been taught, "I'm maintaining position, but you can work." The trauma bay erupted into motion. Holt was already on the gurney, gloves on, calling for the hemostatic dressing kit that Lena had brought and set on the tray beside him without being asked. Nurses flowed into the space the dog had vacated. Monitors were repositioned. Somebody called for surgical prep. Lena stepped back toward the east wall. She was watching the patient's face, the first clear look she'd gotten at it in the chaos. Commander Declan Rourke was unconscious, but his vitals were stabilizing under the initial intervention. He was broad-shouldered, mid-30s, with the particular quality of stillness that people sometimes had when they were very close to the edge. Not peaceful, but spent. His left hand, she noticed, was still resting against the dog's flank. She didn't know when that had happened. The dog was watching her. She looked away. "Marsh." Deborah was at her elbow, voice low. "What the hell was that?" "Calming protocol. Some dogs respond to, 'That wasn't a calming protocol. I've seen calming protocols.' That was a hand signal." Lena said nothing. "Where did you learn a military K9 hand signal?" "EMT course," Lena said, which was not a lie exactly, but was not the answer to the question that had been asked, and both of them knew it. "I'm going to go restock the IV supplies." "Lena, I'll be on the east corridor if anyone needs the cart." She left the trauma bay before anyone could pull her back into the conversation. The east corridor was quiet compared to the bay. Lower light, lower volume, the ambient hum of the building in its after-midnight register. Lena pushed the supply cart to the alcove at the end of the hall and stood there for a moment with her hand on the metal shelf, looking at nothing in particular. She pushed her left sleeve up and looked at her forearm. The tattoo was small, about 2 inches across, positioned on the inside of her wrist where a watch would sit. Most people who noticed it assumed it was decorative. A circle with a stylized symbol inside, the kind of thing that could be read as abstract design if you didn't know what it was. If you knew what it was the unit identifier for the 73rd Combat Rescue Squadron, Air Force Special Operations Command. She pushed her sleeve back down. She had been out for 4 years. She had come to Harrisburg specifically because it was nowhere. Not D.C., not San Antonio, not any of the places where people who knew her history might recognize her face. She had taken the nursing job because it used her skills without broadcasting them, because the work was real and mattered, and she was tired of explaining herself. She had not expected Marcus Holt. She had not expected to care about his opinion either, and she mostly didn't. But there was a specific exhaustion in being systematically made smaller by someone who would not survive 5 minutes in any of the environments she'd spent a decade moving through. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something flatter and more persistent than anger. The fatigue of being underestimated by people with half your experience and twice your authority. She was refilling the IV rack when she heard the voices. 2 of them, men, coming from the administrative corridor that branched off the East Hall. She recognized one of them, Dale Purvis, the hospital's night administrator, a mid-40s man who had the nervous energy of someone who had learned long ago that his job was to keep things quiet and who had gotten very good at it. The other voice she didn't recognize. "Can't release the patient's records without a formal request from the unit command," Purvis was saying. "That's protocol. I don't make exceptions for—" "I'm not asking you to release records," the other voice said. "I'm asking you to give me access to the trauma bay for approximately 10 minutes. That's not— The patient is carrying something. It's not a medical issue. It's a security issue. You understand the difference." A pause. "I can't authorize. Then get me someone who can." Lena stood very still. The voices moved, receding back down the administrative corridor, the conversation dropping below audible range. She stood with an IV bag in each hand and thought about what she'd just heard. The patient is carrying something. She thought about Commander Rourke's vitals, about the dog's behavior, about the way Purvis had gone quiet at the phrase security issue instead of medical issue. She thought about the specific way the man's voice had been flat and certain and professionally neutral in a way that she recognized from a context that had nothing to do with hospital administration. She set the IV bags down on the cart, and then, because she was Lena Marsh, and she had spent 10 years training herself not to walk away from things that didn't add up, she walked quietly to the edge of the East Corridor and looked toward the administrative wing. The man who had been talking to Purvis was standing at the far end of the hall with his back to her. Civilian clothes, dark jacket, no badge visible, average height, completely unremarkable in the way that people who are very good at their jobs are sometimes unremarkable on purpose. He was on a phone. He was also, she realized, positioned so that he had a clear sight line to the trauma bay entrance. Lena walked back to the supply cart and started pushing it toward the north corridor, and she was thinking very quickly and very clearly, the way she had learned to think in situations where the variables were changing faster than the available information could explain them. Something was wrong. Not with Rourke's injuries, those were straightforward, survivable, with proper intervention. Something was wrong with why he was here and who else knew he was here. And the dog's behavior had told her something important that she hadn't fully processed yet. Brace had not been protecting Rourke from the medical staff. He'd been protecting something on Rourke's person from everyone in the building indiscriminately, including whoever had just had a conversation with Dale Purvis about access. She rounded the corner into the north corridor and walked 3 steps before she stopped. Dr. Marcus Holt was standing at the nursing station with a phone pressed to his ear. She had worked with him long enough to read his body language without trying, the set of his shoulders, the specific angle of his jaw when he was calculating rather than reacting. He wasn't calling anyone from the surgical team. His voice was low. She caught 2 words before he turned away. "Already here." Then the door to the surgical prep corridor swung shut behind him. Lena stood in the empty north hall with the supply cart and the quiet hum of the building around her, and something settled into place in her chest, cold and clear and very, very still. She had been invisible in this hospital for 7 months. She was starting to think that was about to become a problem. She had been invisible in this hospital for 7 months, and she was starting to think that was about to become a problem. The supply cart squeaked once on a wheel joint that had needed replacing for 3 weeks, and Lena stood in the empty north corridor long enough to be certain that Holt had not heard her, that the administrative corridor behind her had gone quiet, that she was alone in the particular way that hospitals at midnight made you feel alone, surrounded by noise and activity and completely without witness. She pushed the cart to the supply alcove, parked it, and stood with her hand resting on the metal frame while she worked through what she had and hadn't seen. What she had. A man she didn't recognize, speaking to the night administrator about access to a trauma patient in language that wasn't medical. Holt on the phone outside surgical prep, voice low, using words she couldn't fully hear. A military working dog that had sat for her specifically, not for the calming protocol she'd named for Deborah, because that was a real thing, but not what she'd done. What she'd done was older than any protocol she'd learned in a civilian context, and she'd done it without thinking, which was its own kind of information about where her instincts still lived. What she didn't have, enough. That was the honest answer. She didn't have enough to take to anyone, and even if she did, she'd spent 7 months establishing herself as the nurse that Marcus Holt had publicly and repeatedly characterized as out of her depth. Nobody was going to receive a concern from her about Holt's behavior with any particular urgency. That was the geometry of it. He had built that geometry deliberately, she understood now with a clarity that was almost clean. He hadn't just been dismissive out of arrogance. He'd been managing her, keeping her positioned in a way that would make anything she said about him easy to deflect. Which meant he'd known something about her, or suspected something, from closer to the beginning than she'd realized. She filed that thought somewhere cold and continued thinking. Rourke was in surgical prep. He would be under general anesthesia within 20 minutes if Holt ran true to form on trauma stabilization timelines, which meant that whatever Rourke was carrying, on his person or in whatever had come in with him, would be accessible in ways it wasn't when he was conscious. She left the supply alcove and moved back toward the trauma bay, not hurrying, keeping her pace at the administrative walk that said she belonged in this hallway and was doing a thing she was supposed to be doing. Brace was still in the trauma bay. He had repositioned himself near the door, which was new. His amber eyes tracked Lena from the moment she came into his sight line, and he held that track as she approached. Not moving, not shifting posture, just watching with the quality of attention that the best military dogs had, and that most people encountering it for the first time found deeply unsettling. It wasn't aggression. It was something more like being read. Deborah was at the monitoring station just outside the bay, updating a chart. She looked up when Lena came close. "Rourke's going up to surgical prep in 6 minutes," she said, not looking away from the chart. "Holt's leading. Kendricks is assisting." "Where's the dog going?" Deborah looked up then. "Nobody's figured that out yet. Animal control can't take a military working dog. He's a federal asset." "I know that. I told them. They're waiting on a call back from someone in the duty chain." She set the chart down and looked at Lena directly. "What's going on with you tonight?" "Nothing." "That's the wrong answer. Try the honest one." Lena looked at the dog. Brace had not moved. His eyes were still on her. "Has anyone inventoried what came in with Rourke?" Deborah paused. "His personal effects are in the trauma bay cabinet. Standard procedure." "Who's had access?" "Lena." "I'm not being paranoid. I'm asking a specific question." The older nurse studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that Deborah Fisk had developed over 22 years of working in emergency medicine. The look that could sort genuine concern from anxiety, from the specific flavor of certainty that came from someone who knew something they weren't ready to say. She had seen all three enough times to know which one she was looking at. "Standard access," she said carefully. "Paramedics on intake, the trauma tech on intake. Holt did an initial sweep. That's normal. He does it on all military patients. Protocol for classified status." She paused. "And Dale Purvis was in there for about 3 minutes around 11:58. "Purvis?" "Said he needed to document something for admissions." Lena said nothing. "He didn't take anything," Deborah added. "I was at the monitoring station the whole time. He went in, looked at the cabinet, wrote something down, and left." "What did he write down?" "I don't know. I was monitoring the patient, not auditing the administrator." The intercom above them clicked. "Surgical team to Prep Bay 3. Surgical team to Prep Bay 3. Deborah picked up the chart again. "They're moving him." Lena looked at the trauma bay cabinet. Standard issue, gray metal, combination lock that defaulted to a 4-digit code that every charge nurse on every shift knew. It was not a secure cabinet. It was a storage location. "Deborah," she said, "who requested the surgical suite for tonight?" "What?" "For Rourke." "Who made the OR request?" "Holt put it in as soon as the patient was stabilized, maybe 12:10, 12:15. That's fast. He's efficient, you know that. It's fast for a through-and-through shoulder wound with no confirmed internal involvement, Lena said. You'd normally run more imaging before committing to a suite. You'd want to rule out… Lena. Deborah's voice was quiet and firm. I'm going to ask you one more time. What is going on with you right now? The bay doors opened and the gurney came through. Rourke on it, stabilized, unconscious, the IV lines running clean. 2 surgical nurses flanked him. Holt walked behind them in the composed, forward-focused way of a surgeon who had already moved his attention to the operating suite. He passed Lena without looking at her. Brace stood as the gurney moved past him and took 3 steps to follow it, and one of the surgical nurses said, "No," in a sharp, reflexive voice, and the dog stopped but did not sit, and Lena could see the tension come back into its frame, the held posture of an animal that had agreed to something and was now watching that agreement be violated. He can't come into surgical, the nurse said, looking at the dog and then looking at Lena because Lena was the one who'd gotten it to sit earlier, and apparently that made her responsible for it now. Can you keep it here? He'll stay if Rourke comes back, Lena said. Rourke is going to be in surgery for 2 hours minimum. Lena crouched down to the dog's level, not close, still a respectful distance, still off-axis, still breathing in the pattern she'd been trained to use with high-drive working dogs who were in a compromised emotional state. Brace, she said, quietly. Using the dog's registered name, which she'd heard the paramedic use on intake and which was also the name on the federal asset tag on his collar. The dog's ears came forward. Bleib, she said. The German command for stay, standard for Malinois trained in the military working dog program, and she said it with the exact flat authority of someone who had used it before, not the careful enunciation of someone who had looked it up. Brace sat. Behind her, she heard Deborah make a sound that was not quite a word. The gurney turned the corner and disappeared toward the elevators. Lena straightened up and looked at the dog, and the dog looked at her, and in the quiet of the trauma bay aftermath, the abandoned monitoring equipment, the tray of used supplies, the particular stillness of a room that had just evacuated, she had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that the dog understood more about the situation than most of the humans in the building. Okay, Deborah said from behind her. Now you're going to tell me. Lena turned around. Deborah Fisk was 61 years old and had worked emergency medicine through 3 hospital administrations and 2 major restructurings and 1 very bad influenza season that she spoke about the way veterans spoke about specific winters. She was not easy to rattle. She was also not easy to fool, and she was looking at Lena with the expression of a woman who had decided she was done being patient. Not here, Lena said. The break room's empty. Not the break room. Deborah studied her. Supply stairwell, 3rd floor landing. 5 minutes. The stairwell was cold in the particular way of institutional spaces that the HVAC never quite reached correctly. A damp, recycled cold that smelled faintly of concrete and cleaning solution. The fluorescent above the 3rd floor landing flickered at irregular intervals, which was a work order that had been submitted twice and ignored both times. Lena got there first. She stood on the landing and looked at the fire door and thought about what she was going to say and how much of it was something she could actually say. Deborah came through the stairwell door 30 seconds later, still in her charge nurse scrubs, holding a coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago. Talk, she said. Purvis had someone in the administrative corridor tonight, Lena said. Man I didn't recognize, civilian clothes, no badge. He was asking Purvis for access to Rourke's trauma bay, not medical records, access, to the bay. Deborah said nothing. And Holt made a call outside surgical prep, voice low. I heard him say, already here, before the door closed. That's not… I know it's not evidence. I'm not saying it's evidence. I'm telling you what I saw. Lena paused. Holt rushed that surgical consult. The injury doesn't warrant it. Not at this speed, not without more imaging. A through and through at that entry angle, stable vitals after initial intervention. You run CT, you watch for 4 to 6 hours, you don't put him in a suite at midnight unless there's a reason. Deborah turned her coffee cup in both hands. What kind of reason? The patient is carrying something. The man in the administrative corridor said that specifically, not a medical issue, a security issue. And Brace wasn't protecting Rourke from the medical staff. I was protecting something on Rourke's person from everyone. The fluorescent flickered. Lena, Deborah said slowly, what you're describing, I know what I'm describing. If you're right, you're talking about a hospital administrator and the head of trauma surgery potentially colluding to access a federal military asset's personal effects during an emergency surgery. She stopped. That's a very large accusation. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm telling you what I observed and what it adds up to. Lena looked at the fire door. I need to know if Rourke's personal effects are still in that trauma bay cabinet. If you go back in there, I'm not going back in there. Not yet. She looked at Deborah. But someone should. Deborah Fisk had a long career's worth of experience in not doing things that could get her fired. She also had, under that experience, a bedrock of the thing that had made her good at this job in the first place. The understanding that the reason you showed up to an emergency at all was because someone needed you to do the right thing, and the right thing was frequently uncomfortable. I'll check the cabinet, she said. Routine post-trauma inventory. I'm the charge nurse. It's within my remit. Don't touch anything. I wasn't planning to. She left down the stairs and Lena stood on the landing and listened to her footsteps fade and then turned to look at the concrete wall and think. She had a problem that was becoming several problems layered on top of each other. The first was Rourke, unconscious, in a surgical suite, with a doctor who had at minimum made a suspicious call and at maximum was actively coordinating something that Lena didn't have enough information to fully characterize yet. The second was Brace, who was a federal asset currently unsupervised in a trauma bay, and who was going to become a flashpoint the moment anyone in hospital administration decided to handle the situation without consulting anyone who knew what they were doing. The third was herself. 7 months of carefully maintained invisibility, and she had just used 2 pieces of specialized knowledge in full view of a trauma bay full of witnesses. The hand signal. The command. She'd done both on instinct, without calculating the cost, because there had been a patient bleeding and a dog in the way, and someone had to do something. That was the thing about training that deep. It didn't check with your current cover story before it responded. She was still thinking when her phone buzzed. She almost didn't look at it. Unknown number, and she generally didn't answer those. But something made her look at the screen, and what she saw was not a phone number. It was a text message from a number that began with a military prefix she recognized, and the message was 4 words. We know you're there. She read it twice. Then the stairwell door opened from below, and Deborah came through it with her coffee cup still in hand, and her face arranged in the careful neutrality of someone who has seen something and hasn't decided what to do with it yet. The cabinet, she said. What about it? It's been accessed, she paused. Combination lock was reset. The default code doesn't work. What was in it? Personal effects. Wallet. Phone. No battery. Military ID. She met Lena's eyes. And a secondary bag. Sealed. Tagged as medical equipment, but the tag was printed tonight. The ink's not even fully dry. And the bag itself is the kind we use for biohazard containment. We don't use that tagging protocol for personal effects. Lena looked at the text on her phone. We know you're there. Is the bag still there? She asked. Yes, but... Deborah stopped. There's a padlock on the cabinet now. It wasn't there when he came in. Someone put a padlock on a hospital storage cabinet during an active trauma admission, and nobody on my staff did it. Lena thought about the man in the administrative corridor. It's a security issue. I need to make a call, she said. To who? Someone who can tell me if Rourke was supposed to be here tonight. Deborah stared at her. Was he not? I don't know. That's the question. Lena moved toward the stairwell door. Don't tell anyone about the cabinet. Not yet. Lena, if this is what you think it is, I don't know what I think it is yet. She pushed the door open. Stay close to the trauma bay, and if anyone other than surgical staff tries to access it, call me directly. She went down the stairs at a pace that was almost running. The number she needed was not in her phone. It had never been in her phone. That was a precaution she'd taken when she left the service, a deliberate erasure of the contact architecture of her previous life. Because she'd wanted the separation to be real, and she'd understood that real separation required friction. If she wanted to go back, she'd have to work for it. She went to the hospital's public information terminal in the first-floor lobby, the one that let patients look up visitor information, and used it to access a specific kind of public directory that most people didn't know existed, and that she only knew existed because she'd once spent 6 weeks learning the civilian-facing infrastructure of the organizations she'd worked adjacent to. It took her 4 minutes to find the number she needed. She used her personal cell, stepped outside to the ambulance bay, and dialed. It rang 3 times. "Duty desk," a male voice said. Flat, professional, exactly what she'd expected. "I need a welfare check on a deployed asset," she said. "Registered Unit K7 Brace. Handler is listed as Commander Declan Rourke, SEAL Team." She stopped, because she didn't know his team designation, and getting it wrong would end this call. "I don't have the unit designation. The dog is currently at Maplewood General Hospital in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Handler is in surgery. I have reason to believe there may be a security concern related to the patient's personal effects." A pause. "Who is this?" "Former Air Force, 73rd CRS. I'm a civilian nurse at this facility." A longer pause. "Can you verify?" She recited her service number. It had been 4 years since she'd used it, and she was mildly surprised to find it still lived in her head with perfect precision. 8 digits that had once been the most important number she knew before they became the number she'd tried to forget. The line went quiet for approximately 20 seconds. "Hold, please." She held. The ambulance bay was cold, and the overhead light had a dead bug in the casing that nobody had cleared, and a cab idled at the far end of the bay for no reason she could identify. And she stood in all of it and breathed and waited. "Ma'am." A different voice. Also male, also flat, but with a specific quality of attention behind it. Not the duty desk, something higher than the duty desk. "I need you to describe the secondary bag and the patient's personal effects." Her chest tightened. "You already know about it." "Describe it." "Biohazard containment seal, mislabeled as medical equipment. Newly printed tag. It's in the trauma bay cabinet, under a padlock that was placed there after the patient was admitted." "Is the bag intact?" "As of approximately 8 minutes ago." "Do not let anyone access that cabinet." "I don't have authorization to." "Ms. Marsh." Her name. He used her name, which meant he'd pulled her file in the 20 seconds she'd been on hold, or someone above him had. "Do not let anyone access that cabinet. We have personnel in transit. ETA is..." She heard him say something away from the phone. 52 minutes. "The patient is currently in surgery." "We know. Do not interfere with the surgery. We'll handle the surgical team when we arrive." A pause. "You need to stay in that building, and you need to stay near that trauma bay. Can you do that?" She looked at the cab idling at the end of the ambulance bay. "Yes," she said. "Don't speak to hospital administration. Don't speak to the attending on record. If anyone tries to remove the bag or access the cabinet before we arrive, I'll call back. Don't call back. Text this number. One word. Active." She memorized the number. She had always been good at numbers. "Understood," she said. The line went dead. She stood in the ambulance bay for a moment, looking at the idling cab, and then she went back inside. The lobby was quiet. The night clerk at the front desk was watching something on her phone with one earbud in. The corridor to the east wing stretched out ahead of Lena, and somewhere above her, Marcus Holt had Declan Rourke on a surgical table, and somewhere in the trauma bay, a padlocked cabinet contained something that a voice on the phone had asked about with the particular careful control of someone for whom this was not new information. She found Deborah at the nursing station outside the trauma bay, restocking a medication cart with the particular focused efficiency of someone who was keeping their hands busy while their brain worked on something else. Brace was still inside the bay. Lena could see him through the window. Still in the position she'd placed him, watching the door with the steady patience of an animal that had been trained to wait and had learned that waiting was sometimes the whole job. "Anything?" Lena asked quietly. "Nobody's approached the bay," Deborah said without looking up. "Purvis came through the corridor about 10 minutes ago, saw me and kept walking." "Good." "Lena." She stopped restocking. "There's a man at the end of the hall." Lena didn't look immediately. She made a small adjustment to the top of the medication cart, as if she'd spotted something out of order. "Same one from earlier?" "I don't know. I haven't seen him clearly. He's been there for about 20 minutes, near the fire door. Every time I look up, he's facing the other direction." Lena counted to 5. Then she looked up naturally, scanning the corridor the way nurses scanned corridors, habitually, without fixation. And she saw him. Dark jacket, average height, the same build as the man she'd seen with Purvis. He was looking at the fire door, but his body angle was wrong for someone who wanted to go through the fire door. It was angled slightly toward the trauma bay, and he wasn't moving, and he had the particular quality of stillness that came from someone who was waiting for a specific thing to happen. "How many entrances to this corridor?" Lena asked. "4. East lobby, north stairwell, south stairwell, and the elevator bank." "Is there any reason for a non-medical person to be in this corridor at this hour?" "No." 52 minutes. She looked at the man in the dark jacket, and the man in the dark jacket continued not looking at her. And in the trauma bay behind the glass, Brace turned his head toward the corridor window with the slow, deliberate attention of an animal that had just detected something it recognized as a threat. The dog looked at the man in the dark jacket. Then it looked at Lena, and it stood up. Brace stood, and Lena moved. Not toward the man in the dark jacket. That would have been the wrong move, too direct, too visible, in a corridor where she had no authority and no backup, in 49 minutes until someone arrived who had both. She moved toward the trauma bay door instead, opened it with her badge, and stepped inside. The dog turned to her immediately. Not aggressive, oriented. The same quality of attention it had given her in the trauma bay chaos 3 hours ago, recalibrated now to the smaller, quieter space. "I know," she said, and she wasn't sure if she was talking to the dog or to herself. She went to the bay window and looked out at the corridor from the inside. The angle was better in here. She could see the man without being directly in his sight line. He hadn't moved. I was still positioned near the fire door, still angled wrong for someone who wanted to use it, and now that she was closer, she could see something she hadn't caught from the nursing station. He was wearing an earpiece. Small, flesh-toned. The kind that hospital staff didn't wear, and that security staff at Maplewood General didn't have in their equipment budget. She stepped back from the window. Brace was watching her with his head slightly tilted, the amber eyes moving between her face and the corridor beyond the glass with a tracking precision that reminded her of something she hadn't thought about in 4 years. The way the dogs in her unit had monitored a room, the way their attention was always one step ahead of the situation, processing variables that the humans around them were still catching up to. She checked her phone. No new messages. She texted the number the voice on the phone had given her. One man, East Corridor, dark jacket, earpiece. Not hospital staff. Not moving. The response came back in under a minute. Confirmed. Do not engage. Hold position. She pocketed the phone. Hold position. She had spent a significant portion of her adult life being told to hold position in places where holding position felt like the wrong answer, and she had learned, slowly, through several experiences that had been instructive in ways she hadn't enjoyed, that hold position was usually right when it came from someone who had a fuller picture. The discipline of it was not passive, it was active restraint, which was harder. She held position. Deborah came to the bay window from outside and made a small gesture, a chin tilt toward the east end of the corridor. Lena looked. A second man had appeared at the east lobby entrance, also civilian, also standing at an angle that wasn't quite casual, 2 of them. She raised 2 fingers to the glass. Deborah gave a small nod and moved back to the medication cart. Lena sat on the edge of the unused supply chair in the corner of the trauma bay and looked at the ceiling and counted her resources. She had 1 charge nurse who was competent and discreet and had now seen enough that she understood something was wrong. 1 military working dog that was calm but wired. A text number that had responded in under a minute, which meant someone was actively watching this. And 47 minutes. What she did not have was any way to know what was happening 3 floors above her in Surgical Suite 3. That was the part she couldn't hold still around. Holt was up there with Rourke unconscious, and the surgical team focused on the procedure, and nobody in that room thinking about anything except the mechanics of the surgery, which was how it should be, which was how operating rooms worked, which was also how someone with access to the suite could do something that had nothing to do with the procedure and have it go unnoticed until it was too late. She thought about the bag in this cabinet, the biohazard seal, the mislabeled tag with ink that wasn't dry. She thought about what Holt had said in her second week. You do not second-guess surgical dosing. The reason he'd come down on her so hard for a dosage flag wasn't professional hierarchy. She understood that now, with the specific clarity of information assembling itself into a shape you could finally see. He'd flagged her as a risk immediately, someone with enough clinical background to notice discrepancies. And he'd spent 6 months managing that risk by keeping her small, which meant he'd seen something in her intake documents, or heard something from someone, Or both. She pulled out her phone and looked at the text thread again. Hold position. 44 minutes. She looked at Brace. The dog had settled back onto its haunches but remained oriented toward the corridor, its ears making small adjustments every few minutes, processing the building's ambient sound with the automatic precision of a piece of equipment that had been specifically designed for this. I know, she said again, quieter this time. The dog exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that lowered its shoulders slightly, and looked at her. And then the intercom in the trauma bay clicked on. Nursing staff to surgical suite 3. Nursing staff to surgical suite 3. Immediate. The words were delivered in the flat, controlled tone that hospitals use to mean urgent without causing a patient panic. The tone that every staff member learned to decode in their first month. The tone that meant something had gone wrong in the suite, and they needed hands, now. Lena was out of the bay before she'd consciously decided to move. The corridor was a problem. Both men were still positioned at their ends of it. But she wasn't going to walk past either of them. She was going to the elevator bank, which was in the center, and she moved there at the particular pace that hospital staff moved toward urgent calls. Not running, because running in a hospital caused panic, but the compressed, purposeful stride that communicated priority without spectacle. She got to the elevator and pressed the button and waited the 7 seconds it took for the car to arrive and got in. The man near the fire door had turned to watch her. She kept her eyes on the elevator doors. 3rd floor. The surgical suite corridor was brighter than the ER floors. Cleaner fluorescence, white tile, the smell of antiseptic more concentrated. A cluster of nursing staff was outside suite 3, which told her immediately that the situation inside was bad enough that people had been asked to step back rather than pile in. Priya was there, the second-year nurse with the sharp memory. She grabbed Lena's arm when she came off the elevator. What happened? Lena said. Patient coded, Priya said. V-fib. They called it at 1:43. Lena's chest dropped. No, they got him back. 3 shocks. Got him back. But something's wrong with the anesthesia log. Dr. Holt is saying it was a reaction to the anesthetic agent, but Kendricks... She stopped. Looked down the corridor. Kendricks is saying the dosing was off, not a little off. How far off? Priya's voice dropped. Double the indicated amount for his weight and vitals. Lena stared at her. Kendricks flagged it during the pre-op check and Holt said the system had a calibration error and it had been corrected. But then the patient coded and Kendricks pulled the physical record and the printed log doesn't match the pre-op check she ran. Priya stopped again. She's in there right now, with Holt. I could hear them through the door. Where's the physical record? She has it. Get me in. Lena, you're not on the surgical. Priya. She kept her voice low and even. Get me in. Priya Anand had been a nurse for 2 years, and in those 2 years she had developed very good instincts about when someone knew something she didn't, and she had also developed a capacity for making decisions quickly in situations where the slower, more deliberate choice would be the wrong one. She looked at Lena for approximately 2 seconds. Then she badged the suite door open. The inside of surgical suite 3 was the controlled chaos of a room that had experienced a crisis and come back from it, but hadn't fully reorganized yet. Rourke was on the table, still under, vitals on the monitors showing the cautious, flattened lines of someone who had been brought back from fibrillation and wasn't fully stable. A scrub tech was working the equipment tray. The anesthesiologist, a compact, gray-haired woman named Dr. Valerie Osei, was at the anesthesia station with the focused intensity of someone doing an emergency review. Holt was at the far end of the suite, and he was not looking at the patient. He was looking at Dr. Sandra Kendricks, the assisting surgeon, mid-30s, with the kind of contained fury on her face that came from being both right and in a position where being right was dangerous. She was holding a printed record. The deviation is documented, she was saying. It's right here. The system flagged an error. I corrected it. This record reflects the corrected dosing. This record does not match what I entered in the pre-op log. Then the pre-op log has an input error. Marcus, her voice dropped. That man coded. Patient's code. That's medicine. Not from calibration errors that nobody noticed before induction on a patient who was stable and appropriately assessed. She looked down at the record. I've been in this suite for 4 years. I know what a clean pre-op log looks like. Holt saw Lena in the same moment that Lena stopped moving. His face did the thing it did. the recalibration, the rapid assessment of how much damage could be done by her presence here. And then he made the choice she could see him making, the one where he defaulted to institutional authority because that had always worked before. "Who authorized you to be in this suite?" he said. "I was called," Lena said, which was technically true. "What happened to the patient?" "That's not your concern. I'm the nurse who managed his canine on intake. His dog is in my charge. If the patient's status has changed, his status is stable and being managed by the appropriate team. You are not the appropriate team." His voice was level. It had always been level. That was one of the things about him. He didn't get loud. He got very precise, and the precision was its own kind of pressure. "Leave this suite." Lena looked at Kendricks. Kendricks looked back at her, a calculation happening there, a different kind than Holt's. The calculation of a person who had been alone with a problem for the last 10 minutes and who was measuring whether the nurse who'd just walked in was an asset or a complication. "What's on that record?" Lena asked her. "Don't answer that," Holt said. "Sandra," Lena said, first name, deliberate. "I need to know what's on that record." Kendricks looked at the paper in her hand. She looked at Holt. She looked at the patient on the table whose vitals were still flatly cautious on the monitors. "The anesthetic agent dosing in the intraoperative log," she said, speaking quickly, the way people spoke when they decided to say something and wanted to get it out before they could stop themselves, "is double what was indicated. For a patient with his weight and cardiovascular profile, that dose would cause—" "We are not having this conversation," Holt said. A sustained suppression of cardiac function under certain conditions, which is what happened." She stopped. "He coded, Marcus. For 4 minutes, he was gone. And the log says you corrected a calibration error before induction, but I ran the pre-op check myself and the numbers I entered are not the numbers in that log." The room was very quiet. Dr. Osei had stopped moving at the anesthesia station. The scrub tech had set down the instrument he'd been organizing. Holt looked at all of them with the measured quality of a man who was doing arithmetic, and then he looked at Lena, and whatever arithmetic he'd been doing resolved in a direction that changed his face in a way she'd never seen from him before. Not anger, not dismissal, something cooler and more specific than either. "Give me that record," he said to Kendricks. "No." "Sandra, no." Her voice had steadied. "I'm flagging this to the CMO. The CMO is not available at 2 in the morning. "Then I'll wait." Lena's phone buzzed in her pocket. She did not take it out. She kept her eyes on Holt. "You need to give me that record," he said again, and this time there was something underneath the levelness that she had learned to recognize in a different context. The specific quality of a person who has run out of softer options and is about to use a harder one. "I'll take it," Lena said. Holt turned to her. "I'll take it to the charge nurse station," she said. "It goes in the secure incident file. That's protocol for any anesthesia event that resulted in a code. The documentation is locked pending review." She looked at him steadily. "That's not an accusation. That's procedure. You know that." He did know that. She could see him knowing it, and she could see the problem it created for him. If he pushed back on procedure in front of 2 physicians and a scrub tech, he created a record of pushing back on procedure, which was worse than the record going into the incident file. "Fine," he said. It was a single syllable, and it landed in the room with the weight of something that wasn't fine at all, and everyone in the suite felt it. Kendricks handed Lena the record. Their fingers overlapped on the paper for a moment, and Kendricks looked at Lena with the expression of someone passing a thing they've been holding alone and hoping the next person is stronger than they look. Lena took the record. She folded it once and placed it in the front pocket of her scrub top. "I'll have Deborah open the incident file," she said to no one in particular, and she turned and walked out of the suite before Holt could say anything that would require her to respond to it. The corridor outside was still bright and quiet. Priya was gone, back to wherever she'd been pulled from. The cluster of staff that had been outside the suite had dispersed. Lena stood in the empty hallway for a moment and took the phone from her pocket. The text was from the number. It read, "ETA revised, 31 minutes. Do not let that record leave your possession." She looked at the folded paper in her pocket. 31 minutes. She sent back. "Patient coded in suite. Recovered. Anesthesia irregularity documented. I have the record." The response came immediately. "Get out of that floor." She was already moving toward the elevator. The car took 9 seconds to arrive. She got in and pressed one. Not the ER floor, the lobby level, because she needed to be visible and in an open space, not in a corridor with two men in dark jackets who were now aware that something had happened upstairs. The lobby had cameras. The lobby had a desk clerk. The lobby was a place where things that happened would be observed. The elevator doors opened on the lobby level, and Lena walked out and immediately knew something was wrong. Dale Purvis was at the front desk. At 2:14 in the morning, the night administrator was standing at the front desk with his phone pressed to his ear and the look of a man who had just received information that was reorganizing his understanding of the next several minutes. He saw her at the same moment. He said something into the phone and put it down. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I was just coming to find you." "I'm on my way back to the ER," she said. She kept walking. "There's been a concern raised about your access to the surgical floor," he said, moving to intercept her, not blocking her path, but positioning himself in it. "Dr. Holt has indicated that you entered a surgical suite without authorization." I responded to an all-staff call. The call was for nursing staff assigned to surgical. "I'm nursing staff." "Your ER nursing staff, Miss Marsh." The call was Dale. She stopped. She said his first name with the same deliberateness she'd used with Kendrick's, and it had the same effect. A small reset, a recalibration of register. "There was an adverse anesthesia event in Suite 3 tonight. A patient coded. I have documentation of an anesthesia log irregularity." She watched his face. "If you are asking me to give that documentation to you rather than entering it in the incident file, I need you to say that clearly." Purvis's expression did something complicated. "Nobody is asking you to give anything to anyone," he said. "There's a process." "Great. I'm following the process." She stepped around him. He didn't stop her. She felt him not stopping her, felt the decision behind it, and she cataloged it and kept moving toward the ER corridor. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at it without slowing down. The message was from Deborah. "The cabinet is open. Padlock is gone. Bag is still there, but it's been moved. Someone was in the bay." Lena stopped walking. She looked at the message again. Someone was in the bay. Brace. She turned and went toward the ER at a pace she didn't bother moderating anymore. The east corridor, when she reached it, was different than it had been. Not visibly wrong. The lighting was the same, the ambient sound was the same, the medication cart was still where Deborah had parked it, but the man in the dark jacket was gone. The second man at the east lobby entrance was gone, and the fire door at the end of the corridor was slightly ajar. In the way fire doors were when someone had gone through them recently, and the hydraulic mechanism hadn't fully closed them yet. She pushed through the trauma bay door. Brace was at the far wall, standing, oriented toward the supply cabinet. Not attacking, positioned between the cabinet and the center of the room. The cabinet door was open. The padlock was on the floor. Not cut, not forced. The combination had been run. Someone who knew a combination that wasn't the hospital default. The biohazard-tagged bag was still in the cabinet, but it had been moved to the front of the shelf and the seal had been broken. Lena looked at Brace. The dog looked at the open fire door at the side exit. She crossed to the cabinet and looked at the bag. The biohazard seal was a pull-tab closure. Once broken, it was visible. The bag inside was still sealed with a secondary closure, a zipper lock, and that was intact. Whoever had opened the cabinet and broken the outer seal had been interrupted before they got to the secondary. By the dog. She was certain of it. She texted the number. Cabinet accessed. Outer seal broken on the bag. Internal seal intact. Brace stopped them. She looked at Brace. He was still watching the side exit. "Good boy," she said. "It came out rough." She hadn't said that phrase in 4 years, and it felt like a thing she'd left behind somewhere and just picked up again and hadn't been prepared for. The dog looked at her. Then the side exit door opened. Not slowly. It opened the way doors opened when someone on the other side had decided they were going through it regardless of what was in the way, and the man who came through it was not either of the two she'd seen in the corridor. It was larger, moving with the specific efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of entry before, and he was across the room in 3 strides before Lena had fully processed the fact of him. Brace moved faster. Not at the man, at the space between the man and the cabinet, which was the tactical calculation the dog had been trained to make. putting itself between the threat and the thing it was protecting with the efficient certainty of an animal that had run this calculation several times before. The man stopped. He looked at the dog. He looked at Lena. I was holding something in his right hand, not a weapon, or not an obvious one. A phone. I was looking at her the way the man with the earpiece had looked at her in the corridor, assessing her position, her utility, the degree to which she was a complication. The bag, he said. Step away from it. I'm a nurse in this hospital, she said. Identify yourself. Step away from the bag. I'm not going to do that. He looked at the dog again. Brace had not moved, but the sound coming from its chest had returned. The subsonic vibration, the thing below a growl. That dog is a federal asset, Lena said. If you attempt to harm it, that's a federal charge. If you're here to access that bag, you need to tell me who authorized that access. She kept her voice level. She was measuring the distance to the bay intercom. Right now, the only thing in this room is a nurse, a patient's effects, and a military dog. That's what's on record. Whatever you do next determines what else goes on record. The man's jaw shifted. You don't know what's in that bag, he said. I know it's a federal asset in a federal case and that you don't have authorization to be in this room. She looked at his right hand. And I know that whatever you're planning to do with that phone, you should think carefully about whether the people who sent you here have thought about what happens when military investigators arrive in... She checked the time. 22 minutes. 22 minutes. Something shifted in his face. Not much. Enough. Who did you call? He said. The duty desk for Unit K7 Brace's registered command, she said. Standard procedure when a handler is incapacitated and a federal asset is unattended. He looked at the dog. He looked at the bag. He looked at Lena one more time, with the expression of a man running a calculation where the variables had just changed, and then he took 3 steps backward toward the side exit door. Brace tracked him the entire way. He went through the door. Lena stood in the empty trauma bay with the open cabinet and the broken seal and the dog. And she breathed, in through the nose, count of 4, out through the mouth, count of 6. And her hands were shaking slightly, which she was aware of and which she was not going to do anything about right now. She photographed the open cabinet, the broken seal, the padlock on the floor. She sent all 3 images to the number with one line. He's gone. But he'll be back or he'll send someone. She looked at Brace. The dog had returned to its position by the patient's gurney, which was empty, Rourke still upstairs, and sat with the settled posture of an animal that had done what it was trained to do and was waiting for whatever came next. 22 minutes had become 19, and then Deborah appeared at the bay window, and her face was wrong, not the careful neutrality of someone managing information, but the particular alarm of someone who had just received something she hadn't been prepared for. And she pressed her palm flat to the glass and mouthed 2 words. Lena read them. He's moving, not the man from the side exit. She understood that instantly from the quality of Deborah's face. Rourke. They were moving Rourke. She was out of the bay before the second word had finished forming on Deborah's lips, and she came through the corridor door to find Deborah already walking toward her, speaking low and fast. Holt called a transfer order. He's citing postcode instability. Says Rourke needs a cardiac ICU level of care that Maplewood can't provide. Transfer to regional medical, 30 minutes out. Lena felt the floor drop 6 inches. He can't transfer a postcode patient 30 minutes after resuscitation. He's the attending of record. He has the authority. Not without, he has CMO coverage. Night CMO signed off 4 minutes ago. Deborah's voice was tight. Someone called the CMO directly. Night CMO is Dr. Patel. He's been here 6 months. He trusts Holt's clinical judgment because everyone trusts Holt's clinical judgment and nobody has given him a reason not to. Lena's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Not the number this time. A new number, different prefix, one she didn't recognize. And the message was not a text. It was an image. A photo, taken in a corridor she didn't immediately recognize, of a man in a dark jacket standing outside what looked like a service entrance. The caption read, "We're watching you. Stop what you're doing or the dog gets put down as a public safety risk. We have the paperwork. 19 minutes. She looked up at Deborah. Where's the transfer team? They're staging the transport gurney now, 3rd floor. How long until they move him? 15 minutes, maybe less. 14 minutes until the people she'd called arrived. She was 1 minute short. She looked at the message again. The threat, the photo, the careful construction of it. And she felt something settle in her chest that was not calm exactly, but was the thing adjacent to calm that she had learned in the 73rd. The thing that happened when the situation passed the point of being manageable by caution and became manageable only by action. She looked at Deborah. "I need you to call a code," she said. Deborah stared at her. "A code?" "Rourke, right now. Call a code on Rourke." "Lena, he's stable. He coded 40 minutes ago from a documented anesthesia irregularity, and he's being transferred by the physician who caused the irregularity to a facility 30 minutes away. If he's moved in his current condition and something happens in transit..." She stopped. "Call the code. It triggers an automatic hold on any transfer order. No transport team can move a patient during an active code. You know that. If I call a false code, his postcode vitals aren't clean. You said that yourself. A nurse with 22 years of experience looking at a postcode patient 40 minutes out from resuscitation with documented anesthesia irregularity has grounds to flag instability." She held Deborah's eyes. "It's not a false code. It's your clinical judgment." Deborah Fisk was 61 years old and had not survived 22 years of emergency medicine without understanding when a line was being asked of her. She also hadn't survived 22 years without understanding when the person asking her to cross it was right. She reached for the intercom, and from 3 floors above them, somewhere in the stairwell, Lena heard what she had been waiting 19 minutes to hear. The sound of heavy boots on concrete steps, moving fast, more than 2 sets, coming down with the specific purposeful cadence of people who knew exactly where they were going. The intercom clicked on under Deborah's hand, and the trauma bay door opened. Marcus Holt stood in the doorway. He looked at Deborah's hand on the intercom. He looked at Lena, and his face, for the first time in 7 months, showed her something other than dismissal. "I was afraid." "Don't," he said. Deborah looked at Lena. Lena looked at Holt, and she said, very quietly, the thing she had been waiting 7 months and most of a career to say to someone like him. "You should have thought about this before you decided I didn't belong in the room." Deborah pressed the intercom. Deborah pressed the intercom, and the code call went out across the hospital PA system in the flat, procedural language that every staff member recognized and that triggered an automatic cascade of responses that nobody, not Holt, not Purvis, not whoever was in the stairwell above them, could stop once it had started. "Code blue, surgical floor 3. Code blue, surgical floor 3. Holt took 1 step into the trauma bay and stopped. The automatic transfer hold would have activated the moment the words left the speaker. It was a systems-level lock, not a human decision, built into the hospital's patient management software, specifically to prevent transport during active emergencies. No paperwork Holt filed in the next 10 minutes would override it. He knew that. She could see him knowing it in the way his jaw set and his eyes moved to the monitoring station and back to her with the recalculation of a man who had just watched a door close. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. "I flagged a postcode patient for instability," Lena said. "That's what I've done." "That patient is stable. His vitals. His vitals are a postcode profile 40 minutes out from resuscitation following a documented anesthesia irregularity." She held his gaze. "If you want to argue that he's stable enough to transfer, you'll need to make that case to the code team, in front of witnesses." The stairwell door at the end of the corridor banged open. Not hospital staff. Not the code team. The boots she'd heard on the concrete steps resolved into 4 people moving through the corridor with the kind of coordinated efficiency that did not belong to anyone whose job was medicine. 2 were in civilian clothes, dark jackets, no insignia, the deliberate unremarkability of federal investigators on an active operation. 2 were in military uniform, not dress uniform, working uniform, with the specific insignia of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service on the chest. They moved past the nursing station without stopping and came directly to the trauma bay door. The lead investigator was a woman, mid-40s, brown hair pulled back, a bearing that communicated seniority without requiring any additional signal. She stopped at the trauma bay entrance, took in the room in one sweep. Lena, Deborah, Holt, Brace, the open cabinet, and then looked at Holt with the expression of someone who has reviewed a file and finds that the person in front of them matches it exactly. "Dr. Marcus Holt," she said. It was not a question. Holt looked at her. He looked at the NCIS insignia. Something moved across his face, a series of calculations happening too fast to track individually, arriving at a conclusion that shifted his posture by a degree that most people in the room probably didn't notice. Lena noticed. "Special Agent Diane Varick, NCIS," the woman said. "I need you to stay in this room. I'm the attending of record for a postcode patient currently. The patient is being transferred to the care of a military medical team that is en route to this facility. Your role as attending is suspended pending a federal investigation." She said it with the same register she might use to give a weather report. "Please don't move toward the door." Holt didn't move toward the door. One of the civilian investigators had already crossed to the cabinet. He crouched in front of it, looked at the broken outer seal, looked at the padlock on the floor, and took out his phone and photographed everything in the same sequence Lena had used. Cabinet, seal, padlock, bag. "Ms. Marsh," Varick said. "Yes." "The record from Surgical Suite 3. Lena reached into the front pocket of her scrub top and produced the folded paper. Varick took it, unfolded it, scanned it once, and handed it to the second uniformed investigator without looking away from Holt. "The bag is intact," Lena said. "Outer seal was broken by an unauthorized individual approximately 35 minutes ago. Internal seal is still closed. The dog stopped him before he got to it." Varick looked at Brace. The dog was sitting at the position it had maintained for most of the night, patient side, oriented toward the room's entry points, watching Varick with the calm assessment it had been giving every new person who entered. "Good dog," Varick said quietly. Then to Lena, "Where did the individual go?" "Side exit. I have an image he sent me. A threat." She held up her phone. Varick gestured to one of the civilian investigators, who came and took the phone and began documenting the message. Through all of this, Holt had not moved. He was standing in the trauma bay with the particular stillness of a man who had spent a career being the most authoritative presence in any room he entered, and who was now in a room where his authority had been entirely superseded, and the stillness was not composure. It was the absence of available options. "I want to call my attorney," he said. "That's your right," Varick said. "You'll have the opportunity to do that after we've completed the scene documentation." She looked at the uniformed investigator. "Stay with him." She looked at Lena. "Walk with me." They went out into the corridor. Deborah remained at the nursing station, and Lena had a brief, clear image of her, standing at the medication cart with her hands flat on the surface, watching the investigators move through the corridor with the expression of a woman who had been in emergency medicine for 22 years and had seen a lot of things and was currently revising her personal ranking of what counted as significant. Varick walked at a measured pace toward the end of the corridor, away from the trauma bay, and Lena walked beside her. "You called the duty desk at 1:12 a.m., Varick said, not accusing, establishing sequence. "Yes." "Before that, you were the nurse who managed the K9 on intake." "Yes." "Tell me what you saw from the beginning." "Everything in order." She glanced at Lena sideways. "And don't edit it for what you think I want to hear. Give me the raw version." Lena gave her the raw version. It took 11 minutes. She walked through the intake, Brace's behavior, Holt's response pattern, the man she'd seen with Purvis, the call outside surgical prep, the stairwell conversation with Deborah, the cabinet, the coded patient, the anesthesia log, the transfer order, and the man who'd come through the side exit. She included the text message threat. She included the detail about her sleeve, the tattoo, the dog's recognition. She did not editorialize. She gave Varick what she had observed, what she had inferred, and where the line was between them. Varick listened without interrupting. When Lena finished, the agent was quiet for a moment. "Your service record," she said. "You left 4 years ago." "Yes." "Voluntarily." "Yes." "Why Harrisburg?" Lena looked at the corridor wall. It was far from everywhere else. Varick absorbed that. Commander Rourke was carrying evidence from an active NCIS investigation into a procurement fraud network operating through 3 military contracts. He was the primary witness and the evidence carrier. She paused. "The network had advance information that he was being transported tonight. We don't know yet how far that advance information reached." Lena thought about the man with the earpiece, the 2 positions in the corridor, the combination lock that had been run correctly. "The combination to the trauma bay cabinet," she said. "Someone gave it to them." "We believe so." Purvis. We'll be speaking with Mr. Purvis. Varick's voice was neutral in a way that said she'd already formed a view and wasn't sharing it yet. Dr. Holt's connection to the network is more direct. He has a documented financial relationship with one of the contracting entities under investigation. It's in the records we've been building for 14 months. Tonight was the first time we had reason to move. He knew who I was, Lena said, from closer to the beginning than I realized. He was managing me. We know. He received a summary of your service record through an indirect channel approximately 6 weeks after you were hired. Someone in his network ran your name. She looked at Lena. He was worried about you specifically. The notes he exchanged with his contact mentioned you by name 3 times. Lena absorbed that. He spent 6 months making sure nobody would listen to me, she said. Yes. Varick said it without emphasis or softening. It was a factual acknowledgement of a thing that had happened, and something about the absence of softening made it easier to receive. It almost worked. If Rourke hadn't coded, if the anesthesia event had been cleaner, if Kendricks hadn't caught the log. She caught it because she's good, Lena said. She is, and you caught everything else because you're better. Varick stopped walking. They were at the end of the corridor near the elevator bank. Miss Marsh, in about 20 minutes, this building is going to get significantly louder. CMO, hospital board, legal. They'll all be here. Holt is going to have an attorney. Purvis is going to have an attorney. They're going to look for every procedural irregularity they can find. And you called a code blue on a patient whose vitals, on paper, did not meet the clinical threshold. Lena said nothing. Dr. Kendricks will corroborate the postcode instability concern, Varick continued. The anesthesia log is physical evidence in a federal case, but I want you to understand what the next several hours are going to look like before they start. She met Lena's eyes. Are you ready for it? Lena thought about 7 months. The supply cart. The second-guessed dosing flag. The meetings where she'd spoken and been redirected without acknowledgement. The specific flat register of Holt's voice saying you do not second-guess surgical dosing as if the dosing she'd flagged hadn't been the accurate one. Yes, she said. Varick nodded once. Good. Then let's go back. What happened next was not clean. Lena had understood it wouldn't be. Varick had told her as much. But understanding something in advance and experiencing it in real time were different things. And the 2 hours that followed the NCIS team's arrival at Maplewood General were some of the ugliest and most exhausting hours she'd spent in a hospital that had already provided several candidates for that distinction. The CMO arrived at 3:15. Dr. Rajan Patel was 53, a careful man, genuinely good at institutional medicine, and he arrived in the building to find that the transfer order he'd approved 40 minutes ago had been superseded by a federal investigation, that his head of trauma surgery was sitting in a trauma bay under investigative hold, and that the code blue he'd been notified about had been called by a floor nurse whose name he did not immediately recognize. He was not pleased. He found Lena at the nursing station with Varick, and he looked at her with the specific expression of a hospital administrator processing an unexpected variable. You called the code, he said. Yes. On what clinical basis? Postcode instability concern. Patient coded at 1:43 following a documented anesthesia dosing irregularity. 40 minutes post-resuscitation, the attending filed a transfer order to a facility 30 minutes away. I flagged the transport risk. The attending's assessment was that the patient was stable for transfer. The attending's anesthesia log does not match the pre-op documentation entered by the assisting surgeon. She kept her voice level. I can walk you through the timeline if you need it. Patel looked at Varick. The anesthesia record is evidence in a federal investigation, Varick said. We have it. Patel looked back at Lena with the expression of a man who had arrived expecting to manage an overstep by a junior nurse and was recalibrating rapidly towards something considerably more complex. Who contacted NCIS? I did, Lena said, through the duty desk for the Military Working Dogs Registered Command. You had the number for, I found it through the public federal directory. She paused. I served in the Air Force. I know how to navigate federal duty chains. The information landed. She watched Patel process it. The nurse he didn't know, the service record he hadn't been given, the 7 months she'd spent in his hospital being managed into the background by a man who was now sitting under federal investigative hold in a trauma bay downstairs. Dr. Holt has been on my surgical team for 9 years, he said. It came out differently than she expected. Not defensive, more like a man saying something he needed to hear himself say in order to understand what it meant now. "I know," she said. And she left it at that, because there wasn't anything to add to it that would make it easier or more useful. Varric excused them from the nursing station and steered Patel toward a conference room, and Lena was left standing in the corridor with Deborah, who had been at the medication cart through all of it and who now looked at Lena with the expression she'd been holding back for the last 3 hours. "Your Air Force," she said, "was combat, medical, rescue." Deborah looked at her for a long moment. "How long have you been out?" 4 years. "And you came here?" "Yes." "Why a floor nurse? With that background, you could have—" "I was tired," Lena said. It was the honest answer, and it was also the shortest version of a much longer answer, and Deborah had enough sense to hear both. "Well," the older nurse said. She turned back to the medication cart and straightened a row of saline bags that didn't need straightening. "You're not tired anymore." At 4:20 a.m., 2 things happened within 8 minutes of each other. The first, the military medical team arrived and took custody of Commander Rourke. 4 people, 2 of them physicians, moving with the efficiency of a unit that had been briefed en route. They reviewed the chart, reviewed the anesthesia log copy that Varric provided, and spent 12 minutes in direct consultation with Dr. Kendricks, who had stayed through all of it, who was visibly exhausted and visibly unbending, before determining that Rourke was stable enough for supervised transport to a military medical facility 40 minutes away with full cardiac monitoring throughout. Brace went with them. He came through the corridor on Lena's left, flanked by one of the military physicians, moving with the settled purpose of a dog that had done its job and was now going where it was supposed to go. He slowed when he passed Lena, just slightly. A deceleration, 3 steps at a reduced pace, his amber eyes finding hers in the corridor light. She put her hand out, flat, palm down. He pressed his nose against it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he moved on. She stood there for a moment with her hand still extended and the warmth of his nose against her palm already cooling, and she was aware that several people in the corridor had seen it and that none of them were saying anything. The second thing that happened at 4:28, Dale Purvis was escorted from his administrative office by one of the civilian investigators. He came through the lobby corridor in a different register than she'd ever seen him, not the nervous, efficient energy of the night administrator managing contingencies, but something smaller and tighter, the posture of a person who has been told specific things about what investigators know and who has done the arithmetic. He was not in handcuffs. The investigator beside him was walking, not restraining, but Purvis's hands were in his pockets, and his eyes were on the floor, and he did not look up as he passed the nursing station. Deborah watched him pass. "He reset the cabinet combination," Lena said. "He's the one who told them the combination. When he went into the bay on intake, he wasn't documenting admissions. He was noting the cabinet location and running the default to confirm it worked. And then he gave the reset combination to whoever put the padlock on." "Yes." "Which means he knew they were coming before Rourke even arrived." Lena thought about the earpiece, the 2 positioned men, the advance information Varric had mentioned. Rourke was supposed to be stopped before he got here. When that didn't work, the plan shifted to accessing what he was carrying while he was in surgery. And Holt was the inside piece. He's been the inside piece for a while. She looked at the corridor where Purvis had gone. "I don't know how long. Varric does." Deborah folded her arms. She was tired. The kind of tired that 2 a.m. put into a person's bones that no amount of cold coffee addressed. "They used the hospital," she said, "as an asset, a location where they had someone in a position to access a federal patient." "Yes." "And Holt's been here 9 years." "Yes." Deborah said nothing for a moment. Then, "All those patients." The 2 words landed with everything that wasn't said around them. 9 years of surgical authority. 9 years of cases where the numbers had been what Holt said they were, and nobody with enough standing had checked. Lena didn't know what the scope of it was. Varric hadn't told her, and she hadn't asked, partly because there were things she genuinely didn't know, and partly because there were things she didn't yet want to know. "They'll audit it," Lena said. "That's what comes next. That's going to take months." "Yes." At 5:10 a.m., Varric found Lena in the break room. She was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that was hot, which was unusual for this hour, and she was looking at nothing in particular. The television mounted in the corner was on with no sound. A weather broadcast showing a satellite image of a weather system over the Midwest, greens and yellows rotating slowly over the map. Varick sat across from her without being invited, which was the kind of thing investigators did, and which Lena didn't mind. Holt's attorney arrived, Varick said. He's been advised of the federal charges: obstruction, conspiracy to interfere with a federal investigation, accessory to assault on a federal asset. She paused. The anesthesia event is being reviewed separately. That goes to the state medical board and potentially the DA, depending on what the review finds. Lena looked at her coffee. He'll argue the anesthesia event was a genuine error, Varick continued. He'll have expert witnesses who will testify about calibration anomalies and the rates of variance in intraoperative dosing records. It'll be contested. Kendricks has the pre-op log. She does. And her testimony is credible, but contested is what defense attorneys are paid to create. Varick folded her hands on the table. The federal charges are cleaner. The financial connection to the contracting network is documented. The communications between Holt and his contact are documented. The cabinet access tonight is documented on hospital security footage. She paused. And the threat sent to your phone is documented. Was it the man from the side exit? We believe so. We have him on camera at the east parking structure. We'll have an identity within a few hours. Varick looked at Lena directly. Ms. Marsh, what happened tonight, the way it was handled, a significant part of the reason this evidence is intact is because of the decisions you made between midnight and 2 a.m. I want to say that clearly. Lena said nothing. You identified the threat when nobody else was looking. You protected the cabinet. You called the right people. You kept the transfer from happening. She stopped. You also called a code that was clinically defensible and procedurally correct, and I want to make sure the CMO's office has that framed accurately when they review it. Is that going to be a problem? Varick considered. Patel is a careful man. He's going to want the institution protected. The code will be reviewed, the clinical basis will be examined, and some of the people in that review will be looking for a way to characterize it as an overreach by an unauthorized staff member. She met Lena's eyes. They won't find one, but they'll look. I know. Kendricks will support you. I'll put a formal statement in the federal record. I know, Lena said again. They sat in the quiet break room for a moment. The weather map rotated on the silent television. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. The hospital returning to its normal register, the overnight routine reasserting itself around the edges of the night's damage. Your service record, Varick said. The 73rd CRS. Yes. You were a PJ. Pararescue. The word landed in the break room with its actual weight. The specific thing it meant about the training required, the casualty environments it described, the specific kind of person it produced. Yes, Lena said. Varick looked at her for a moment. Why did you leave? Lena wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Someone I was trying to bring out didn't make it, and I made the decision to finish the extraction anyway, which was the correct tactical decision, and I've agreed with it every day since, and I also haven't been the same since. She paused. Those aren't contradictions. They're just both true. No, Varick said. They're not contradictions. They sat with that for a moment. What happens to Rourke? Lena asked. He'll recover. The cardiac event was serious, but he's young and the baseline fitness helps. He'll be out for a few months, then… Varick lifted her shoulder slightly. Then that's his business. And the evidence he was carrying? In federal custody as of 4:07 a.m. Chain of custody is clean. She paused. Because of the secondary seal. Because of the dog, Lena said. Yes, because of the dog. Lena drank her coffee. At 6:15, when the morning shift began to arrive, Lena was still at the nursing station on the East Corridor. Not because anyone had asked her to stay, but because she was the charge of record on the Trauma Bay documentation, and there were forms to complete and hand off notes to write, and the ordinary administrative persistence of a night that had been anything but ordinary. The morning nurses came in and found federal investigators in the corridor and an NCIS evidence seal on the Trauma Bay door, and Lena Marsh at the nursing station filling out forms with the focused composure of someone at the end of a long shift, which was what she was. Priya came in at 6:20 and stopped when she saw Lena and took in the corridor and the tape and the investigators and then looked at Lena with an expression that was somewhere between awe and the specific feeling of arriving at a party after the most interesting thing has already happened. "I want the full version," she said. "I have 3 forms to finish." "After the forms." "There might not be an after the forms for a while." Lena. "Go clock in, Priya." Priya went to clock in, but she kept looking back down the corridor at intervals, the way people looked at something they were still processing. At 6:47, Varick came back to the nursing station with one of the uniformed investigators and a tablet, and she sat down across from Lena with the professional deliberateness of someone who had one more thing to do. "We need a formal recorded statement," she said. "Everything you told me earlier, on record. It'll take about an hour." "Now?" "If you're able." Lena looked at the form she was completing. She finished the last line, signed the bottom, and set the pen down. "Yes," she said. The statement took an hour and 14 minutes. She went through it in the same order she'd given it to Varick in the corridor, clean, sequenced, without editorializing. And when it was done, she signed the transcript, and the investigator notarized it and took the tablet and left. Varick stayed. She was looking at the tablet she'd been taking notes on, and she had the expression of someone who has finished the operational part of a situation and is now sitting with the shape of it. "There's something I didn't tell you earlier," she said. Lena waited. "Holt's communication with his contact, the 3 times he mentioned you by name." She set the tablet face down on the table. "The last message was sent at 11:38 tonight, 45 minutes before Rourke's ambulance arrived." She paused. "He knew Rourke was coming before the ambulance call came in." Lena stared at her. "The dispatch log shows the call came in at 11:47, Varick said. "Holt's message to his contact was 11:38. She let that sit. He wasn't reacting to the patient's arrival. He was expecting it. He'd been briefed by the same people who positioned those 2 men in your corridor. Which means the ambulance routing was not random. Maplewood General was selected. Rourke was directed here." Varick's voice was even. "And Holt's message at 11:38 mentioned that his problem on the floor, his words, had been stable for months and would not be an issue." His problem on the floor. Lena sat with that. 7 months of being made small. 7 months of the supply cart and the second-guessed dosage flag and the meetings where she'd spoken and not been heard. All of it deliberate. All of it calculated to ensure that when a night like this one arrived, she would be positioned far enough from the center that nothing she said or did would reach it in time. It had almost worked. "He called me a problem," she said. "Yes." She looked at the table. "He was right," she said. "He just underestimated how much of one." Varick almost smiled. It was a small thing, a compression at the corner of her mouth that lasted less than a second. "Yes," she said. He did. The morning light was starting to come through the break room window, the gray pink of early Pennsylvania fall, and Lena looked at it and felt the weight of the night in her shoulders and her lower back and the specific place behind her eyes where exhaustion accumulated after a long shift. She had 3 more forms to complete. She had a handoff briefing to give. She had somewhere in the middle distance a conversation with Patel that she was not looking forward to and could not avoid. She also had, for the first time in 7 months, the particular sensation of standing in a building where her presence had been accounted for. Not praised, not celebrated, just counted. She stood up from the table and picked up her pen. And then Priya knocked on the break room door frame and said, "Lena," in a voice that had a quality Lena didn't immediately identify, and she turned. Priya was holding her phone out. On the screen was a hospital internal message. Sender listed as CMO office, timestamped 6 minutes ago, recipient list that included Lena's staff ID. She read it. Then she read it again. It was brief. 4 sentences. The 3rd sentence contained her name. The 4th sentence contained a phrase she had not seen in any communication from this institution in 7 months. Effective immediately. Nursing staff are directed to include Ms. Marsh in all critical care briefings pending formal review of her service credentials and potential reclassification. She stood in the break room doorway with Priya's phone in her hand and the morning light coming through the window and the sound of the hospital shifting into its morning register around her, and she felt something move in her chest that was not triumph and was not relief exactly, but was the quiet, private acknowledgement of a thing that had been true all along finally being said out loud. She handed the phone back. 3 forms, she said. Lena. Then I'll sleep. She moved past Priya into the corridor. Wake me if something explodes. She was almost to the nursing station when the elevator doors opened at the end of the hall, and a man she didn't recognize stepped out. Civilian suit, federal ID clipped to his breast pocket, moving with the specific gravity of someone whose arrival meant the situation had escalated to a level above the one she'd been managing. He looked at the corridor. He looked at the NCIS tape on the trauma bay door. He looked at Lena. "Miss Marsh?" he said. "Yes." He reached into his jacket and produced a card. She took it. The seal on it was not NCIS. It was a different agency, one she recognized and had hoped, in some quiet part of her, she would not be seen in this building. "We need to talk about your service record," he said. "Specifically, the classified operations during your last deployment with the 73rd, he paused. "And about Commander Rourke." She looked at the card. She looked at him. "All of it," he said. "We need all of it." She looked at the card. She looked at him. "All of it," he said. "We need all of it." The card was heavier than federal ID cards usually were. Or maybe that was just her perception, the accumulated weight of a night that had started at a supply cart and ended here, in a corridor with morning light coming through the windows, and a man who wanted the version of her that she'd spent 4 years filing away. "I haven't slept," she said. "I know. I'm sorry." He said it like he meant it, which was unexpected. "I'm Special Investigator Warren Gale, Defense Intelligence. We've been tracking the procurement network for 18 months. Commander Rourke's operation was part of a broader effort to surface the financial architecture behind it." He paused. "Your actions tonight intersected with that effort in ways we didn't anticipate. We need to understand your background to understand the intersection." "You already have my service record." "We have your official record. I'm asking about the parts that aren't in it." She knew what he meant. There were operations she'd been part of in the 73rd that existed in classified annexes that her official file didn't reference, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because the environments those operations had occurred in were ones the military preferred to account for obliquely, in language that said very little and implied the rest. "Give me a cup of coffee," she said. "A real one." He almost smiled. "I think I can manage that." They sat in the same break room where she'd sat with Varric an hour earlier, and Gale produced 2 coffees from somewhere in the hospital that had better equipment than the break room's ancient drip machine, and Lena drank half of hers before she said anything. Then she talked. She gave him the version he was asking for, not the redacted official version, but the one underneath it, the one that lived in muscle memory and the specific texture of certain hours she had not discussed with anyone in 4 years. 3 deployments. The last one in a theater she wasn't going to name in a hospital break room, but that Gale clearly already knew about from the way he listened, the way he didn't react to certain details with the surprise of someone hearing them for the first time. She told him about the extraction that had gone wrong. Not the tactical version, the human one. The person she'd been trying to bring out. The decision she'd made. The correct decision, the one she'd carry for the rest of her life. She hadn't told anyone that part. Not the version that was true. Gale listened to all of it with the particular quality of attention that meant he was not going to use it against her, which was the thing she'd needed to establish before she said it. She'd learned how to read that. The difference between someone gathering information and someone gathering understanding. Varric had it. Gale had it. "Why does this intersect with Rourke?" she asked when she was done. Gale set his coffee down. "The contracting network your unit was operating against in your last deployment. The procurement fraud we've been tracking isn't the same network, but there's an overlap. One of the entities involved in tonight's situation had a connection to logistics infrastructure that was active in the same theater during your final tour." He paused. "We found your name in documents recovered from that network 6 weeks ago. Not as a target, as a witness. Someone in the network had identified you as a potential threat to their domestic operation before you ever walked into Maplewood General." She sat with that. "They knew where I was," she said. "They've known for approximately 2 months. And Holt was already embedded. When your name surfaced in their internal communications, someone connected the dots and flagged you to him as a risk to manage." Gale looked at her steadily. "You weren't a coincidence, Ms. Marsh. Maplewood General wasn't random for Rourke, and it wasn't random for you. They chose this facility partly because they had Holt, and partly because they'd assessed that the one person with the background to recognize what was happening had been effectively neutralized. The morning light had shifted, fuller now, the early orange of actual sunrise rather than the gray pink of the hour before it, and it came through the break room window and lay across the table between them. They underestimated how thoroughly he'd done the job, she said. Yes. They thought you were neutralized. Holt thought you were contained. Gale picked up his coffee again. Neither of them accounted for a military working dog that recognized your unit tattoo. She thought about Brace's amber eyes in the chaos of the trauma bay, the 2 seconds of contact, the sit. He didn't recognize the tattoo, she said. He recognized the hand signal. The tattoo just confirmed it. Same result. Different thing, she said, because it mattered to her to be precise about this. The tattoo is just ink. The signal is training. The dog responded to who I am, not what I used to have on my arm. Gale looked at her for a moment. Fair distinction, he said. At 9:15 a.m., Marcus Holt was formally arrested. Lena was not in the corridor when it happened, but Priya was, and Priya told her about it later with the compressed factual quality of someone who had understood in the moment that what they were witnessing mattered and had paid attention accordingly. 2 federal agents, handcuffs. The standard recitation of rights in the East Corridor, in front of the nursing station where Lena had spent 7 months being redirected and dismissed. 3 members of the morning shift witnessed it directly. 2 attending physicians who had been on their way to the surgical floor stopped at the corridor junction and stood there until it was done. Holt did not say anything. That was what Priya kept coming back to. The fact that he was silent through the entire process. Not the calculated silence of strategy, but the silence of a man who had run out of registers to perform in. 9 years of institutional authority, and when it was stripped away in a hospital corridor on a Tuesday morning, there was apparently nothing underneath it that wanted to speak. The handcuffs were the part Priya couldn't stop thinking about. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were ordinary. The same hardware used on anyone, the same procedural click, the same walk to the elevator. Nothing about it acknowledged what he'd been in this building for nearly a decade. It just ended, the way things ended, without the weight the occasion seemed to deserve. Did anyone on the staff react? Lena asked. Priya thought about it. Kellerman from cardiology looked away. Nguyen just watched. Deborah, she paused. Deborah watched the whole thing and then went back to the medication cart. That was right, Lena thought. That was the correct response to the end of something that had caused quiet damage for a long time. Not celebration, just watching, and then going back to work. Dale Purvis was arrested 40 minutes later in the administrative wing, where he had apparently spent the intervening hours since his interview with the investigators in his office, with the door closed and no outgoing communications. His phone records confirmed it, as if he'd been hoping that sitting still would alter what was coming. It didn't. He was walked out through the lobby, which was busier than the East Corridor at that hour, and several patients in the waiting area saw it, and by noon it was on the local news in the compressed partial form that local news handled ongoing federal investigations. The man from the side exit, the one who'd come through the trauma bay door before Brace stopped him, was identified by 9 a.m. from the parking structure footage. His name was not released, but Gale told Lena that he had a documented history with 2 of the contracting entities under investigation and had been operating as a domestic asset for the network for approximately 3 years. He was taken into federal custody at a location outside Harrisburg that Gale did not specify. The 2 men who had been positioned in the East Corridor, Earpiece and East Lobby entrance, were identified from hospital security footage and picked up separately, one at a motel 11 miles from the hospital and one at the Harrisburg bus station in circumstances that Gale described with a single word, uneventful. By 11 a.m., the operational architecture of what had happened at Maplewood General in the preceding 12 hours had been documented. The key individuals were in federal custody, and the evidence Rourke had been carrying was formally logged in the Defense Intelligence chain of custody, its contents in the hands of the people whose job it was to use them. Lena sat in the break room and ate a vending machine sandwich and thought about sleep. She didn't sleep. Not because she couldn't. Her body was at the point where it would have accepted sleep on the break room table without complaint. But because at 11:40, Dr. Sandra Kendricks knocked on the break room door and came in and sat across from her with the particular look of someone who has made a decision and is delivering on it. The CMO's office called me this morning, Kendricks said. Formal review of the anesthesia event has been opened. State Medical Board notification goes out today. She paused. I gave them the pre-op log and my written account of what happened. Good, Lena said. They asked me about the code call. She looked at Lena steadily. I told them it was clinically defensible, because it was. Thank you. Don't thank me. It was the truth. She put her hands flat on the table. I've been in this hospital for 4 years. I've worked with Holt for 3 of them. I noticed things. Dosing calls that seemed aggressive, post-op outcomes that were harder to explain than they should have been. And I filed them away as within the range of acceptable variance because he was Holt, and Holt was what this hospital was built around. She stopped. I was wrong to do that. Lena said nothing. I'm not asking you to absolve me, Kendrick said, a little sharply, reading the silence. I'm telling you because you should know that you weren't the only one who saw things and didn't act on them. You're the one who did act. That's a meaningful difference. She paused. I just wanted to say that in a room where it was only you and me. They sat with that for a moment. How many cases are they going to review? Lena asked. Everything from the last 5 years as a start. Kendrick's voice was flat. It's going to take a long time, and it's going to be very bad in ways we can't fully see yet. She looked at the table. Some of those patients are still here. Some of them aren't. The weight of that settled in the room. The ones who are still here deserve to know, Lena said. Yes, they do. Kendrick stood up. I'm going to make sure they find out from someone who explains it clearly, not from the news. She picked up the chair she'd pulled out. You should sleep. I know. I mean, actually sleep, not sit here thinking. I know what sleep means, Sandra. Kendricks almost smiled. It was tired and genuine and a little complicated, the smile of someone who was going to have a very long few months ahead of them and knew it. Good, she said, and left. Lena did not sleep until 2:17 p.m. Before that, she completed her handoff documentation, briefed the afternoon charge nurse on the status of the trauma bay, still under evidence seal, expected to be released by end of day, and sat through a 40-minute meeting with Patel and 2 members of the hospital board and a legal representative whose name she immediately forgot because the legal representative didn't say anything that required remembering. The meeting was not comfortable. Patel was careful and fair, which was the best she could have expected from him, and the board members asked questions that were shaped more by institutional liability than by genuine interest in what had happened. And Lena answered all of it with the same flat clarity she'd been using since midnight. At the end of it, Patel looked at her across the conference table with an expression that had something genuine in it underneath the administrative caution. I owe you an acknowledgement, he said. I approved that transfer order without adequate review. You trusted your attending, she said. That's not an unreasonable thing to do. It is when the signs were there. He paused. I've been told that Dr. Holt's communication to his contact at 11:38 specifically characterized you as a neutralized risk. His jaw moved slightly. I want to know what this institution did to create the conditions for that characterization. It was a more honest question than she'd expected from him, and she answered it honestly. She walked him through the 7 months. The dosing flag. The meetings. The systematic removal from critical cases. She did it without editorializing and without anger, because the anger had somewhere become something else. Not gone, but changed into a form that was more useful than heat. Patel listened. He took notes. He was quiet for a moment at the end. The CMO directive this morning was a first step, he said. It's not sufficient. I'd like to have a more formal conversation about your role in this institution. Your actual role, based on your actual background. When you've had time to rest and when the immediate situation has stabilized. He paused. If you're willing. I'm willing, she said. She meant it. Not with the performed willingness of someone agreeing to something they weren't sure about, but the actual version. The willingness of someone who had spent 4 years being tired and had, somewhere between midnight and now, stopped being quite so tired. She slept for 5 hours on her couch in the apartment 12 blocks from the hospital, and when she woke up, it was raining outside the window. The kind of fall rain that came down without drama, steady and gray, the sort of rain that made the city look like it was being cleaned. She had 4 messages. The first was from Deborah. You should have told me. I would have stood with you from the beginning. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. The second was from Preya. I told everyone. Not the classified parts, just the part about you. I hope that's okay. I think people needed to know. The third was from Varick. Formal statement is in the federal record. Your cooperation has been noted at the relevant levels. If you need anything from our end going forward, use this number. The fourth was from a number she didn't recognize, and when she opened it, there was no text, just an image. A photograph taken in a hospital corridor she didn't recognize with the clean, bright lighting of a military medical facility. In it, Commander Declan Rourke was sitting up in a hospital bed, pale, visibly diminished, the shoulder wrapped and the monitoring lead still attached. And Brace was on the floor beside him, pressed against the bed's base with the settled patience of an animal that had decided this was where it lived now. Rourke was holding the phone out at arm's length, taking the photo himself, and he was not smiling exactly, but there was something in his face that was in the neighborhood of relief. At the bottom of the image, someone, Rourke or whoever had helped him send it, had typed 4 words. He told me everything. She sat on the couch with the phone in her hand and looked at the photograph for a long time. The rain came down outside. The apartment was very quiet. She thought about the dog pressing its nose to her palm in the corridor. The 2 seconds. The warmth already cooling by the time she registered it. She texted back. Tell him he did his job. The response came 40 seconds later. He wants to know when you're coming back to work. She looked at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she sent. She went back on Thursday. The East Corridor was different in the specific way that corridors were different when something had happened in them that people knew about. A texture to the air, a quality of attention that hadn't been there before. People looked at her differently. Not with awe, which would have been wrong and uncomfortable, but with the recalibrated look of someone updating a file, taking the information that was now available and integrating it with what they'd seen before and arriving at a revised understanding. Some of the nurses she'd worked alongside for 7 months stopped her in the corridor and said things. Some of them said the things well, direct, without excessive apology, the kind of acknowledgement that accepted what it was acknowledging without turning it into a performance. A few of them said the things badly. Too much, too performed, the guilt of people who had watched something happen and hadn't intervened trying to compress itself into a single conversation. She was patient with all of them, because she'd been the person who hadn't intervened in situations she should have intervened in, and she knew how that felt and what it cost. Deborah didn't say anything when Lena arrived at the nursing station. She just handed her the morning chart rundown and said, Bay 2 has a status change from overnight. And Lena took the chart and said, got it, and they got to work. That was right. That was the correct version of acknowledgement between people who understood that the work was the point. At 10:15, Patel found her on the East Corridor and asked if she had 20 minutes. She did. They walked to his office, which she'd never been in, and he closed the door and they sat across from each other at a desk that had the organized, functional clutter of someone who spent real time at it. I've been speaking with our department heads, he said, and with the board, and with our legal team, and with the Federal Liaison Office. He paused. We're restructuring the nursing integration with trauma operations. The siloing that existed, ER nursing versus surgical versus critical care, allowed the conditions that Holt exploited to persist without adequate cross-check. He looked at her. We're creating a role, clinical integration coordinator for trauma operations. It would sit across departments rather than within one. It would have real authority to flag concerns at the attending level and require formal response. He paused. I'd like you to consider taking it. She looked at him. It's a new role, he said. We'd build it together. Your military background, your clinical experience. It's the right combination for what this hospital needs to be now. He stopped. What we should have been before. She thought about the supply cart, the IV bags, the 7 months of being handed tasks designed to keep her hands busy and her voice quiet. She thought about Kendricks with the printed record in her hands, looking at a room full of people and deciding to speak anyway. About Deborah's palm flat against the trauma bay glass, mouthing 2 words in the dark. About a dog sitting in a trauma bay on her authority alone, holding position for an hour in an empty room because she'd given a command and it had trusted the person giving it. I have conditions, she said. Patel nodded. Tell me. The review of Holt's case history goes back 7 years, not 5. I want the extended window. Agreed. Kendricks leads the clinical review team, not an external body. She knows the cases and she has the standing. She's already indicated she wants to do it. Agreed. The CMO directive about including me in critical care briefings becomes permanent policy. Not a temporary measure, but written into the nursing integration protocol. Agreed. She paused. And the role reports directly to you. Not through a surgical chief, not through any intermediate administrative layer, directly. Patel was quiet for a moment. That's unusual. So is spending 7 months being managed into silence by the person I'm supposed to be checking, she said. I need the structure to match the function. He considered it. She could see him working through the institutional geometry, the board implications, the departmental politics, the question of what it would mean to have a nursing coordinator with direct CMO access. It was not a small thing he was being asked to agree to. All right, he said, direct reporting, written into the charter. She looked at him for a moment. He was not a bad man. She'd understood that early, before she'd understood anything else about this building. He was a careful man who had trusted the wrong person's judgment for too long, and he was now doing the harder work of building something differently, and that was worth something. Then yes, she said, I'll take it. 3 weeks later, Marcus Holt was formally charged in federal court with conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, accessory after the fact to assault on a federal asset, and financial fraud in connection with 3 military contracting entities. The charges were read in a Harrisburg federal courthouse on a Wednesday morning, and a reporter from the local news was there, and the story ran that evening in the compressed, partial way that legal proceedings ran on local news. The state medical board opened a formal disciplinary proceeding on the same day, covering 9 cases flagged in the initial audit of his surgical record. 3 of those cases were referred to the district attorney's office for review. The proceeding was expected to take 8 to 14 months, according to the board's public statement. Lena didn't watch the news broadcast. Priya sent her a link and she bookmarked it and didn't open it because she'd said everything she had to say about Marcus Holt in recorded statements to 2 separate federal agencies and a hospital review board, and the courtroom and the medical board were the right places for the rest of it to happen. The places with the authority and the process to hold what had been done in a form that meant something. She did not need to watch it happen. She just needed it to happen. Dale Purvis accepted a cooperation agreement with federal investigators and provided testimony about the network's domestic operation in exchange for reduced charges. The specifics of his agreement were not public. What was public eventually was that his testimony helped establish the financial architecture of the network at 3 additional locations outside Pennsylvania, which led to 7 additional arrests over the following 6 weeks. Lena learned this from Varick, who sent her a brief factual update by text on a Tuesday evening, and Lena read it on her couch and set the phone down and sat with it for a while. Not with satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction implied that the accounting was complete, and it wasn't and wouldn't be for a long time. But with the settled feeling of something moving in the direction it needed to move. Slowly, imperfectly, with the grinding procedural weight of institutions doing the hard work of correcting themselves, but moving. Commander Declan Rourke was discharged from military medical care on a Thursday morning, 11 weeks after the night. He'd arrived at Maplewood General on a gurney with a Belgian Malinois standing over him like a guardian no one could move. He called her. She was at her desk in the small office that had been allocated for the new coordinator role, a real office, with a door, which was still occasionally surprising, and her phone rang with the military prefix she'd seen twice before, and she answered it. Ms. Marsh, he said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected. Not weak, just used. The voice of someone who'd been through something and come out the other side still standing but not unchanged. Commander, she said. Declan is fine. A pause. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for about 8 weeks. You don't have to say anything. I know. I want to. Another pause, shorter. The evidence I was carrying, the network documentation, it was used in proceedings at 3 facilities, part of a larger operation that had been running for 14 months. What happened at your hospital was the piece that let us move on all of it simultaneously. He paused. That doesn't happen if you don't protect the bag. Brace protected the bag, she said. Brace protected the bag because you told him to hold position. She could hear him shift, a careful movement, someone still managing a shoulder injury. He's back on duty, by the way, passed his return-to-service evaluation last week. Something in her chest eased that she hadn't realized was still tight. Good, she said. He was... They said he was distracted during part of the evaluation, kept orienting toward the evaluator's left arm, a pause that had something in it she couldn't fully read. They said he'd never done that before. She looked at her left forearm. "Tell him I said hi," she said. Rourke laughed, a short, rough sound. "I'll pass it along." He was quiet for a moment. "I heard you took a new role. At the hospital." "Yes." "Good." He said it simply. Not congratulations, not praise, just the acknowledgement of a thing that was right. "You should be in the room." "Yes," she said. "I should." After they up, she sat at her desk for a while with the phone on the surface in front of her. The office window looked out on the east corridor. She could see the nursing station, the medication cart, the section of hallway where the two men in dark jackets had stood on the night in question, long gone now, replaced by the ordinary traffic of a hospital going about its ordinary work. The trauma bay was in use. Through the window, she could see Priya inside it, running a monitoring check on a patient who'd come in an hour ago with a chest complaint that had turned out to be non-cardiac and was going to be fine. The patient was an older man, talking more than he probably should be, and Priya was listening to him with the particular expression she wore when a patient was telling her something long and tangential, but she'd decided to let it go on because he needed to say it. That was the work. Not the night Holt was arrested or the morning the federal charges were filed or any of the moments that would be worth telling later. The work was Priya standing in the trauma bay with an elderly man and letting him talk, and Deborah straightening saline bags that didn't need straightening, and Kendricks going through 9 years of surgical records line by line in a conference room down the hall, looking for the truth in cases where the truth had been deliberately obscured. The work was the ordinary persistence of people who showed up and paid attention and did not look away. Lena had spent 4 years believing that the version of her that belonged in hard places was the old version, the combat medic, the pararescue man, the person with the service number and the classified deployment and the tattoo on the inside of her wrist. She had spent 4 years treating the version that existed in blue scrubs with a supply cart as the lesser version, the one that was waiting to become something else. She had been wrong about that. The thing she'd carried from the 73rd was not the training, though the training had mattered last Tuesday night in ways she was still cataloging. It was not the service number or the classified files or the hand signals. It was the understanding, the one that pararescue burned into you in the first 6 months and the rest of your career confirmed, that the person who saves the life is not always the person anyone was looking at. You showed up. You paid attention. You did not leave the room when the room got hard. That was the whole job. It had always been the whole job. She was still sitting at her desk when Deborah knocked on the open door at 3:50 p.m. and leaned against the frame with a chart in one hand and the look of someone who has been thinking about how to say something for a while. "Bay 2, Deborah said. "Status changed again. You should come look." Lena stood up. She put on her lanyard, the new one, with the new title on it, which she was still getting used to looking at, and picked up her pen and walked out of the office into the east corridor, where the afternoon shift was in full motion and the ordinary urgent work of the place was ongoing, and people moved around her and alongside her and toward her in the normal way of people who have revised their understanding of who is standing next to them. She walked toward the trauma bay. She did not walk toward it like a person who had been restored to a position she deserved. She walked toward it like a person who had always known where she was going and had simply been made to take the long way. The long way had cost her. She was clear-eyed about that. 7 months, the slow erosion of being made to feel like less than what you were, the exhaustion of performing smallness for an audience that required it. Those costs were real, and they did not evaporate because the person who had imposed them was now in federal custody. The accounting was not even. It was never going to be perfectly even. But she was in the room. She was in the room and she was not leaving it, and every person in this building knew now what she'd brought to it from the beginning. There is a specific kind of person who is made to feel invisible, not because they are invisible, but because the people in power can see them very clearly and understand exactly what they represent. Those people are not invisible. They are dangerous to the comfortable order of things. They notice dosing discrepancies. They recognize hand signals that no ordinary nurse should know. They stand still in a trauma bay while a military dog assesses them. And they breathe, and they wait, and they do not leave. The world will try to put those people in the corner with the supply cart. It will try to make them feel like the room doesn't need what they're carrying. It is wrong every time. Lena Marsh pushed